in the palace of Henry VIII, one of history's most powerful rulers. How did a queen's fate plummet from the throne to the gallows in just 17 days? This event, which unfolded amid the cold stones of the Tower of London, was not merely an execution. It was also a process interwoven with psychological torture, political reckoning, and a tragedy etched into history. This video will reveal Anne Boleyn's final 17 days and that terrifying journey step by step, because in this story, you will see not only how a woman was torn apart, but also how justice, religion, and politics were shattered. On the morning of May 19, 1536, London awoke to a grey sky. A thin mist hung over the River Thames. In the inner courtyard of the Tower of London, a scaffold erected by workers during the night stood out. However, this scaffold was different from others. Instead of the high platform used for traditional executions, a lower structure had been prepared. The reason for this was an unusual executioner and the weapon he would use. This time, the axe would be replaced by a sword. Moreover, the executioner was not English, but had been brought in specially from France. Whispers circulated among the crowd. Today, a queen will die. Today, for the first time in English history, a queen's head will fall. At that moment, in the tower, Anne Boleyn, waking up to her last morning in her tiny room, still drew attention with her elegance. She was only 35 years old. She had been imprisoned in the tower for 17 days. Only a few loyal ladies-in-waiting remained by her side. As Anne prepared to dress for her execution, she chose her clothes carefully. She put on a dark gray fur-trimmed cloak. Underneath, she wore a dark red corset that would not show blood. According to witnesses, as she dressed, she held her neck gracefully and smiled, saying, "My neck is small." This statement was an expression of dark humor and fearless acceptance, but the real question was, how had Anne Boleyn gotten to this point? Anne was born to Thomas Boleyn, an ambitious diplomat, and the noble Elizabeth Howard. She spent most of her youth at the French court. There, she was immersed in the Renaissance culture of the time, learning dance, music, and literature. Everyone around her admired her intelligence, while the beauty ideal of the time was fair skin and blonde hair. Anne stood out with her dark complexion, black hair, and deep gaze. But what made her truly attractive was not her appearance. It was her knowledge, intelligence, ability to speak languages, and her power to captivate those around her. The moment that changed her destiny came when she caught the attention of King Henry VIII. Henry had been unable to produce a male heir with his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. A male heir was of vital importance to the Tudor dynasty. That is why he set his sights on Anne. However, Anne refused to be merely the king's mistress, as her sister Mary had been. It is said that she told Henry plainly, "If you want my heart and body, you must give me a crown." This challenge would set in motion a chain of events that would change the course of English history. For 7 years, Henry pursued Anne. To win her, he made decisions that would shift the balance of power, not only at court, but across all of Europe. At the end of this passionate pursuit, which lasted from 1526 to 1533, Henry severed his ties with the Roman Catholic Church. Rejecting the Pope's authority, he declared himself head of the Church of England. This step symbolized not only a love affair, but also a complete transformation of England's religious and political structure. In 1533, Henry and Anne married in secret. Anne was pregnant at the time. The king was eagerly awaiting a male heir. However, the baby born in September was a girl, the future legendary ruler, Elizabeth I. This was a disappointment for Henry, as his obsession with a male heir took precedence over everything else. Anne's reign as queen lasted only 3 years, but its impact was profound. She supported reform movements and spearheaded the dissemination of English translations of the Bible. She encouraged the development of art and intellectual life at court. However, she also gained many enemies. Her intelligence and political influence were perceived as threatening, especially by men. Anne's failed pregnancies further weakened her position. She miscarried in 1534. She became pregnant again in 1535, but this time the baby boy was stillborn. In Henry's eyes, Anne had now exhausted his hopes. The powerful figure at court, Thomas Cromwell, also played a significant role in her downfall. Cromwell was both politically at odds with Anne and aware that the king wanted to remarry. In early 1536, Cromwell and his enemies at court began to weave their intrigues. The goal was clear: to dethrone the queen, destroy her reputation, and marry Henry to another woman. Thus began Anne's final 17 days. On May 2, 1536, a minor incident occurred during a tournament at Greenwich Palace. The queen dropped her handkerchief to one of the knights. This gesture, which was completely innocent, triggered Henry's jealousy and rage. The next day, Anne Boleyn was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and plotting against the king's life. The irony of history was this: there was no evidence for any of these accusations, but evidence was unnecessary, because Henry had already made his decision. Anne's reign as queen would come to an end, and a new wife would take her place. 17 days of psychological torture, a sham trial, and ultimately execution began at this point. On May 2, 1536, Anne Boleyn's life was suddenly turned upside down during a tournament held at Greenwich Palace. The queen dropped her handkerchief to one of the knights. At the time, this was a completely innocent gesture. However, when Henry saw this, he stormed out of the hall in anger. The next day, despite being queen, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. The charges were unbelievable: adultery with 5 men, incest with her brother George, and plotting against the king's life. Before any investigation had even taken place, Henry had already signed her death warrant. When Anne arrived at the Tower of London, she thought she would be thrown into a dark dungeon, but a more painful torture awaited her. She was placed in the magnificent rooms where she had stayed 3 years earlier before her coronation. The same carpets, the same furniture, the same view. But this time she was preparing not for queenship, but for death. The Tower commander, Sir William Kingston, wrote in his reports that Anne often burst into laughter, then into sobs. These laughs were not a sign of victory, but of her mind slowly shattering. Every move Anne made was under surveillance. 4 maids had been assigned to her. However, these were not loyal servants, but spies. They constantly reported her prayers, dreams, and conversations to Kingston. Anne desperately struggled to prove her innocence. She even went so far as to say, "Let my body be examined. My innocence will be proven." But no one wanted to hear her, because this case had been brought not for justice, but to be concluded. On May 15th, a historic sham trial began in Westminster Hall. Who wasn't on the jury? Anne's uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, her former lover, Henry Percy, and Jane Seymour's relatives. In other words, both Anne's enemies and the family of the woman who would replace her. She had no right to defend herself, no lawyer, and could not call witnesses. The charges were absurd. The dates did not match, and the evidence was fabricated on paper. Despite this, Anne defended herself with extraordinary composure. She responded to each witness's testimony individually, impressing everyone with her intelligence and eloquence. An observer present wrote, "She seemed not like a woman, but an angel." But the outcome was clear from the start. 27 jurors unanimously declared her guilty. Her punishment would be death by burning. However, Henry, supposedly showing mercy, decided that the sentence would be carried out by beheading. At that moment, Anne's fate was sealed. When the trial ended on May 15th, Anne Boleyn's fate was sealed. Every hour spent in the Tower of London now meant waiting in the shadow of death. Her punishment was execution, and Henry presented her being killed by the sword, rather than burned at the stake, as an act of mercy. But the fact that this particular executioner had been brought in from France also symbolized that she was never truly accepted as an English queen. Mother prayed during her remaining days and gave her ladies-in-waiting small gifts, a prayer book, a handkerchief, a small piece of jewelry. When the morning of May 19th arrived, she waited for hours for her death. First it was postponed until noon, then until the afternoon. This delay tormented her soul even more. She swore repeatedly to her innocence, saying she had never betrayed the king. As the drums began to beat around noon, the crowd gathered in the courtyard fell silent. There were nearly 1,000 people, but the atmosphere was not one of celebration, but of deep sorrow. The mother walked to the pier in her gray cloak and red dress. Her steps were calm, her head held high. Those who witnessed that moment wrote that she did not succumb to fear, but rather maintained her dignity. When she stepped onto the scaffold, she was allowed to speak one last time. While everyone expected her to accuse the king, Anne chose a different path. "I came here to die by law. I will accuse no one. May God protect the king. He has been a good master to me." These words were not only gracious, but also an effort to protect her daughter's future. Because if she had accused Henry, little Elizabeth's situation could have become even more dangerous. After his speech, he removed his cape and hood and gave them to his attendants. He knelt down, his eyes blindfolded. The executioner, following tradition, shouted, "Bring me my sword." To distract him, the moment the queen turned her head, the sword finished the job in one stroke. Instead of applause, silence rose from the spectators. Cannon fire signaled to Whitehall. Henry was now free. The next day, he became engaged to Jane Seymour, and 10 days later, they were married. No coffin was prepared for Anne's funeral. Her body and head were hastily placed inside an arrow box and buried at St. Peter ad Vincula Chapel. Her grave was unmarked and nameless. This was the greatest humiliation for a queen. But the irony of history was that, despite Henry's best efforts, Anne's memory could not be erased. Her daughter Elizabeth ascended the throne years later. She ruled England for 45 years, and her reign was known as the Golden Age. Elizabeth used her mother's symbol, the white falcon, in her palaces, wore a secret ring with her mother's portrait on her finger, and never married. "I am married to England," she declared, carving out a destiny different from her mother's. In 1876, while the chapel was being renovated, a small female skeleton believed to belong to Anne was found and respectfully reburied. Today, at the Tower of London, where she was executed, there is a simple glass plaque. Flowers are placed on it every year. Anne Boleyn went down in history, not only as a tragic figure, but also as a symbol of how power, politics, and injustice were ruthlessly applied to women. And the greatest irony was that it was the daughter of the woman he had killed who ultimately made Henry's legacy truly enduring.